Welcome everyone, welcome back if you joined us for the first session, and welcome to anyone coming in new. This is the second session of the day, which is a very important subject, especially with it being Mental Health Awareness Week. We've seen a worrying increase in mental health issues since the start of the pandemic, so it's important that businesses acknowledge and address this. I'm very pleased to introduce Ellis Whyte, who's the founder of Mindset Mental Health, who's going to talk to us today about how to support employee mental health as we move into a new normal. Please send your questions in and we'll do our best to answer as many of these as we can during the Q&A session, which Catherine from our last session will be taking. So good afternoon, Ellis.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me today. So as you have already thankfully introduced me, my name is Ellis Whyte and I am a business psychologist and director of Mindset. So business psychology is a field dedicated to improving the quality of working lives, and that is something that is essential to improving employee mental health. So mental health has been a growing concern of recent years. About 1 in 4 people will experience a mental health concern in any given year, and it is evident that businesses need to support and be prepared to support those individuals where they may be experiencing poor mental health, particularly after the pandemic. So mental health affects our work, our productivity, how we learn, socialise, how we cope with stresses in life. And having mental health and good mental health and well-being is integral to reaching our full potential. So if someone doesn't receive adequate mental health support, then there's a greater risk that they will achieve lower academic and employment outcomes, which will then result as a loss of income to not just the individual, but then also the organisation. And there's a lot of risks, many risk factors that can have an impact on our mental health. And unfortunately, the lockdown has increased our exposure to those risk factors. So I've put a few risk factors on the screen there, but some interesting statistics to be aware of what's happened over the pandemic. It's been reported that more than half of adults, about 60%, have said that their mental health got worse during lockdown, with many who already had previous experiences of mental health concerns has seen their mental health and well-being decline as well. There are certain risk factors that are and groups of people that are more at risk as well. So during COVID, the UK's domestic abuse service Refuge actually reported a phenomenal 950% increase in visits to their website. So family conflicts in particular have been reported to increase exponentially over the pandemic. About 1 in 10 ambulance call-outs were mental health related. There was evidence that people were drinking more. And so overall, we do need to be more mindful that we are vulnerable to mental ill health at this time, and not just currently, but also the aftermath of lockdown. Social distancing measures and economic consequences are likely to have long-term impacts on what we have experienced with our mental health, much longer than the physical health impacts of COVID. So I'm sure you're aware that mental health has been a primary concern over the lockdown, and we've seen higher incidences of things like depression and anxiety. But I would strongly advise all organisations to not just consider the impact of mental health and well-being and mental illness, but also consider the impact on not just our emotional well-being, but also our social and psychological well-being. So our lockdown lifestyle has been very repetitive, as I'm sure you've all appreciated, and people have noticed that they've found it difficult to focus, their memory might not be as efficient, and this repetitive lifestyle has almost led to this cognitive decline. So that's where people find it difficult to focus, feeling restless, distractible, might experience moments of poor performance and memory, and also it affects our mental health. And we've seen this happen in previous studies as well. So an example, there was a study where they paid college students to sit in one room and and study all day and night, and they weren't necessarily allowed to go out and socialise. And they recognised that they became restless, distractible, irritable, and they couldn't think clearly for any length of time. And they didn't perform very well on cognitive tests compared to a group that were a control group, so they had the ability to go out and socialise. There's various other studies where they've recognised that the impact on sort of shutting yourself away can have a severe impact on your cognitive health and your mental health. There's been some instances where people have been self-isolated, not necessarily due to research, but also because of what's happened to them in terms of historical events. So they've got an example here where somebody ended up lost in a cave for 6 months until they were found. 205 days they were lost, and by the time that he came out, they could barely string thoughts together. And every year in the US, they incarcerate people and unfortunately spend weeks or months at a time in small windowless cells and segregated from other people. And then they've experimented there, and they've recognised that extreme isolation points to a range of negative cognitive consequences. So it's interesting to see how previous studies have recognised that being shut away or not having opportunities to leave the house as much, not having opportunities to socialise face to face, does have an ability to impact our cognitive health as well as our mental health. And unfortunately, that's something that they're quite concerned about post-pandemic. So this cognitive decline has often been called brain fog. It's not actually a medical condition, but it's something that's being considered and studied across the world now, because it's a very common complaint that people have. And particularly, it's a very common complaint that's happened during lockdown. And because similarly, we've had an experience of a lack of social contact. We've been isolated within the four walls of our home, staring at a computer screen, working from home, and we've had restrictions on our usual lifestyle. So many of us have tried to keep busy during the initial lockdown. People were even inspired. So some people, there was an increase in home improvements. So apparently £55 billion was made during the first wave of the pandemic since March due to the home renovations. There was 1 million downloads of the Couch to 5K app from March to June. Numbers of new businesses were formed and launched, and banana bread seemed to have a serious moment through lockdown. But too much time at home has led to what you could call perhaps pandemic fatigue. We're absolutely sick of it, and the novelty of our newfound hobbies, pets, Zoom quizzes, clapping on the doorstep, and 14 months on, this Groundhog Day where every day feels the same, we are struggling to adjust, and the new normal has taken its toll. And working from home presents a few more risk factors that can lead to brain fog. So the first one is called Zoom fatigue. So we're mostly all burnt out with using various video conferencing softwares, and studies has also shown that socialising online doesn't actually have the same benefits of our mental health as it would face to face. So that lack of eye contact in particular doesn't trigger oxytocin, that social bonding chemical or hormone that we need, and that further leads to brain fog and depression. And what makes things worse is that no one really wants to take time off work at present, probably because there's nothing to do and you don't want to waste annual leave. But time off is essential for our well-being and productivity, because without it, we would feel this brain fog would eventually lead to perhaps even burnout. And two of the most common risk factors of lockdown and mental ill health is presenteeism and leavism. So presenteeism is where somebody is still showing up to work, but not usually as productive, and that's usually because of mental ill health or potentially brain fog, and it stops us from working well and reaching our full potential. So if you take COVID out of the equation, actually sickness absence has fallen over the pandemic, and the Office of National Statistics reported that home workers took less annual leave and fewer sick days in 2020. So companies may view that as a benefit, but actually individually that person is likely to not be working to their full capacity, feeling the need to potentially work because there's nothing to do, or they may even work longer hours to catch up because they are not necessarily being as productive. And that tends to lead to people feeling unmotivated, unfulfilled, and quite unhappy at work. The cost of presenteeism alone is estimated to cost the UK economy over £45 billion a year, and that is actually double the cost of absenteeism. So not taking time off when you're not feeling your best is not actually better for business. Then we have leaveism, so that's the act where somebody is unable to switch off and tends to work outside of normal hours. And during the pandemic, the ONS reported that home workers did more overtime, with some people working enough time to total another day's work each week, often unpaid. So it might be that they were answering emails late at night when they came through, or it might be that they worked a few hours additional each day, maybe worked through their lunch break. So that all added up to an average of another day's work each week. And while increased use of technology can enhance working practice, having the ability to work outside of normal hours can actually add to the challenge of maintaining good mental health and well-being. And it makes it hard for someone to disconnect from that always on culture. And again, consequently leading to this brain fog and burnout. So in terms of adjusting to the new normal, there's quite a few things that we can do to support mental health and well-being, whether it is that you plan on heading back to the office, working from home, or potentially adjusting to both and having a mixture of both. So there are 5 key things that I would say to any organisation and their employees when it comes to supporting mental health, wherever it is that you plan on working. And the first one is having realistic expectations. So both with yourself, but also within the office in your working life. It is both a blessing and a curse that we can flip between meetings in seconds, meet people all over the world without having to leave our seats. But the problem is that having back-to-back meetings doesn't necessarily mean we're going to be more productive. And I've met so many people that have adjusted to the home working situation where they've planned so many meetings in their time, gone back-to-back meetings with Zoom, but not actually had any time to complete the work that they're discussing, which then leads to them feeling overwhelmed, leading to them wanting to work late. And then again, it leads back to that leaveism. So be aware of how much you're trying to fit within your day and have realistic expectations. We're not as productive as we normally would be, and every single day our productivity levels might differ. So be mindful of that. And we also need to set realistic expectations because people respond differently to change, okay? And we need to be respectful that not everybody is going to enjoy coming back to work or enjoy working from home. People feel very differently. Everybody's got different circumstances in life. Some people really enjoy the office. Some people really enjoy working from home. So just be realistic with expectations on how people are going to adjust, and they might feel quite anxious about the next change within their home working life. So be realistic with your expectations. The second thing is setting boundaries, particularly yourself, setting boundaries with yourselves and with work. So an effective way of being productive is having things like set working hours, maintaining a proper schedule, just as you would normally have within an office. So if you do work from home, make sure you have a dedicated workspace. Try and get dressed. I mean, I know I'm guilty for having sat in a top half looking quite presentable and then having pajamas and slippers on the bottom half, because no one can see that side of you when you're working from home and working in the office, on Zoom or Teams or whatever that conferencing platform you use. But actually not getting dressed does have a quite dramatic impact on your productivity, because people feel like they're relaxed and might get more distracted. So get dressed, set your hours, take a lunch break as well. And when you have a lunch break, try and take a separate lunch break somewhere away from your office or away from your desk. And taking a lunch break each day where you actually rest is incredibly important. And try and start and finish at the same time as well. And if you start to incorporate those boundaries into your working life and having that work-life balance, you will find that you'll be more efficient. It keeps your attention, you'll be more productive. You may also notice a marked improvement in your mental health and your social health. So the most effective way for staying productive is taking breaks, really, but also switching off. So longer breaks has been shown to increase productivity. So we've mentioned about lunch breaks, but also remember to disconnect when you're not meant to be working, and also turn on notifications, okay? Turn off notifications. A lot of people have their work emails coming through their phone, coming through their computers, coming through their smartwatches perhaps. And having those constant notifications coming through can have an impact on how we're feeling. So be mindful, turn off those notifications if you can, and take all of your time off or away from work seriously. So if anyone is feeling like they are experiencing poor mental health, then do talk to a professional, and encourage others to do the same. So we need to try and reduce the stigma about getting help for your mental health. We have all been a lot through this year, and it's a completely rational response to experience poor mental health during this time because of the storm of risk factors that we've mentioned. So we need to drum into everybody at work that it's okay not to be okay, and it's okay to have some help from a professional as well. So wherever you are, if you are experiencing poor mental health, please do talk to a professional and get the support that you need and deserve. And finally, if someone doesn't receive adequate mental health support, we've mentioned they will likely achieve lower employment outcomes, and that constitutes a loss to the individual, but then also the organisation. It costs the organisation more if they're experiencing presenteeism, if they have time off as well, if they end up needing support but like long-term sick, if they potentially leave the organisation as well, it does tend to cost more. So having a proactive mental health strategy has a high return of investment. If you can engage your office and engage your workers, and improve and sustain mental health and well-being in the organisation, it will promote morale, improve services, promote staff retention, lower sickness absence in a healthy way, and have a marked improvement of your office, and it has financial benefits as well. So times like these are integral to maintaining a healthy workforce, especially if you're going to start implementing changes, going back to work or adjusting to agile working both from home and the office. So having a mental health strategy is integral to that, and do get in touch with us if you need some support there. A mental health strategy can be things like looking at your policies and procedures, looking at risk assessments, making sure that you have training and potential mental health first aid support. Perhaps you might want to create a survey where you would assess your staff and where they are in terms of their well-being and how they feel at work. And that can be a good opportunity to identify what interventions might be better received. So that is my my talk for today. Does anybody have any questions?
Oh, Elise, we've got several questions coming in. First of all, you've done some great tips there for what we can do to support people. Can I just ask? I think often the first step is the most difficult. So, Russ, what's your top tip? The first step that perhaps employers should be looked to taking to start on that journey to support people. What's your top tip there?
I would probably talk to a professional, such as myself, or talk to somebody who is able to assess your workplace and give you ideas of what it is that you need, because it's difficult to say there's one top tip. Potentially training is you know, it has a high return of investment, but every organisation is different and every organisation has different risk factors. So, you know, just blindly implementing mental health strategies, you don't necessarily know whether they're going to be well received with the type of workplace that you have. So I would suggest to have professional support to make sure that whatever you do, you get the most value out of.
Great, thank you for that. I've had a question. How do we separate stress from work to enjoying time outside of work, especially sort of moving forward? So I think really looking for some ways of making that break between the stresses of work and home life. Any tips there for them?
I'd certainly suggest that if you feel that you are having, if you're feeling stressed on more days of the week and it's having a severe impact on your day-to-day life, my first thing would be talk to a professional, so you can get some mental health support there, because a lot of people, you know, we lose half of all working days lost in the UK are due to stress, anxiety and depression. So it's really common that people experience stress and find it difficult to separate themselves in that work-life balance. And if it's having a profound impact on your life and your day-to-day life, I'd certainly talk to a professional. But the one thing that I would try and build into everybody's routine is self-care. My favourite saying is, you can't pour from an empty cup, and so many of us don't necessarily take that time and energy to work on ourselves, and we wouldn't let our phones run out of battery, so why do we expect us to continuously run on empty and work ourselves right until we've used all of our energy? So I'd certainly encourage everybody to try and take some more time out for their own self-care as well.
Do you think there's anything employers can do to try and stimulate that and really underpin that? Because I think a lot of people, we've heard from the first session, you know, people are saying take breaks and whatever else. Is there anything practical that employers can do to say, no, we really mean it. If you do this, it will really help you look after yourself? Is there anything you've seen with any other companies that would be helpful?
Yes. So within your organisation, you know, it does need to be strongly advising your workforce, you know, look after your mental health and well-being. So one thing you can do in terms of your employees is communications, having communications and regular communications to try and create that culture, and, you know, to consistently have that same message, because it's all well and good doing mental health awareness week sessions, or, you know, something once a week or once a year, sorry. But that doesn't necessarily create that culture or create that message that we genuinely care about your mental health and well-being. And that's often something that a lot of organisations do. They do certain events, but they don't necessarily do it consistently. So I would have events or communications that consistently are spread throughout the year to all of your employees. And that information can be about stress, it can be about Mental Health Awareness Week, it can be about you know, activities that you've got on throughout the year. Whatever it is that you do, as long as it's consistent, it will drum that message into your employees.
Thank you very much. I've got a specific question here from somebody who says they can relate very much to the brain fog. How can we overcome this? What actions can we take if we know the brain is not working like it used to? I mean, I may just say for me, I mean, I've had quite a lot of instances of that, and actually I've just taken literally a few moments, shut my eyes, few deep breaths, and sometimes it's enough just to sort of get me through it, but I'm sure there are better ways. So please, you give your professional opinion would be greatly appreciated.
Absolutely. And whoever's asked that question, I can tell you that even myself experienced that throughout the pandemic, and I think we all have to some extent. And the first thing I would say is be kind to yourself. You know, this is what we've had to experience. We haven't had any control over the situation and where we were, and so we are going to have realistically experienced some brain fog. So I'd be kind to myself. And you know, if I was struggling to get through my to-do list that day, I would just make sure that I would, you know, recognize that and say, okay, well, that's what I know why that is. It's because I'm feeling this brain fog. It's because I've been in this room for this day, and for such a long time. So the first thing I'd say is be kind to yourself. But the second thing, if you want to try and re-engage that brain, try and take short breaks throughout the day. Your concentration span is at its optimum for 20 minutes. So people stopped listening to me about half an hour ago, probably. So yeah, 20 minutes is your optimum concentration time. It's helpful to know that, so that, you know, if you start to find it difficult to concentrate, stop and do something else very quickly, even if it means, you know, just standing up, walking to somewhere and coming back and sitting down. That can actually have a good impact on your brain, or switch to a different task for momentarily and say, right, I'm just going to answer this email and then I'm going to come back to this, and it will just sort of reset your focus. And then if you are really experiencing that brain fog and it's you know, you'll find it really difficult to concentrate, one of the best things you can actually do is exercise. So exercise, it gets your blood flowing, your endorphins going, it helps you feel better in terms of your mood. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to get up and go for a run. Even a 10-minute walk can reduce our stress levels. So, you know, just pop outside, pop to the end of the street and back, get a bit of fresh air, get a bit of exercise in. And if you're not one that regularly engages in exercise, just be proud of every step you take. And, you know, if it's a couple of minutes, that's still going to have an improvement on your energy, your well-being, your productivity. So I would, at times, if I was really struggling with my brain fog, I would actually have to stop, take the dog for a walk, and then come back and start again.
Thank you very much. I'm going to roll a couple of things into this one. We've got a question here: is what else can an employer do once an employee is diagnosed with poor mental health and being treated? How can an employer help an employee in the meantime if still at work? And can I add something else? We've talked a lot about professional help. I think sometimes it's difficult to know who we should turn to. There's lots of people advertising this, that and the other. I think a few tips as to the sort of people we should engage with who will have the right tools might be helpful from you too.
Yes, great questions. Okay, so starting off with the first part of that question, so what can employers do to support an employee who's been diagnosed? So the first thing is I would do is I'd sit down with them and say, is there anything that I can do, that we can do from an organisation point of view? Because there's no point in making decisions on their behalf. And in fact, that will come under the Equality Act. So you can't necessarily treat anybody differently because they have an experience of poor mental health. So I would treat them like a human being, sit down with them and say, you know, really grateful that you've disclosed this. Is there anything that you that you need? There is something called a wellness action plan, which is really helpful if you're not sure about the types of questions to ask. Mind actually do a wellness action plan, which is free to download. And there are two versions of it, one for an employee and one for an employer, which talks about the questions. And you fill out this document, and it's things about, like, you know, are there anything that triggers you throughout the day that we can be aware of, and potentially we can try and reduce the risk of you coming into contact with those triggers. So you could sit down with your employee, ask them what they need, and then fill out a wellness action plan to help you understand how to keep them safe and supported at work, and what it is that you can do in terms of reasonable adjustments.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful.
And then Sorry, the second part of that question was professional help, wasn't it? So
yes.
Where to go for professional help? Your first port of contact usually is your GP. If your organisation has an employee assistance programme, that is also another fantastic organisation to go through. And just a moment on the employee assistance programmes, or EAPs. EAPs are third-party organisations, so your employer is paying for them, so they're nothing to do with your employer. And if you access them, they are free, entirely confidential. Your name, details, absolutely nothing is shared with the organisation. Or the services that you use from them. So it's free, confidential, 24/7. You can have access to counsellors, and a lot of places have access to counselling, but they also have access to other services such as financial advice services, legal advice services, health and wellbeing services. So whatever it is that you are experiencing, if you have an EAP, it's really worth having a look there. And if you and a lot of companies undervalue and underuse their EAP service. So find out if you have one and promote it, because it's a fantastic service. And usually you will get counselling within the week if it's something that you deem as necessary. You can get advisors from, very quickly as well. So it's a fantastic service. So GP, EAP. If you need to speak to someone urgently, you can phone NHS 111. So that will get you out of hours GPs, that will get you a crisis team if it's necessary. And if anyone is at risk of harm to themselves or others, then you can phone 999.
Thank you. I think that's very comprehensive and gives people lots of places to go. I've got a comment here that I'll probably say something off first and then let you carry on with it. You'll see.
Sure.
I think one of the most stressful things about return to the office is use of public transport rather than being in the workplace. Any tips? Now, I think we will be discussing this later on, in the fact that I think employers are very much mindful of this being a stressor for people.
Mm-hmm.
And my advice is, and I think I said a lot of people, is look at flexible working so that you start to use public transport when it is more controllable and that type of thing. So that's my penny's worth. But Ellis, is there anything you'd like to add for that?
Yeah, that would have been my exact response. I would encourage you to talk to your employer, because there's a lot of people that are feeling exactly the same. So I talk to my employer and say I'm feeling quite apprehensive or anxious about getting public transport, the tube, or whatever it is that you need to access, and have a discussion about flexible working. Perhaps you might feel more comfortable maybe starting a little bit later, so that you miss rush hour, or like changing your hours so that you miss rush hour. Or perhaps you want to wait a little while until you get more into the routine of life kind of after COVID, as things start to reopen again. So it's really worthy of speaking to your employer, and they should respond with some reasonable adjustments for you. Other tips as well is to, if you are experiencing mindfulness, is to think of some calming techniques that you can do. So a lot of people experience anxiety when they were wearing the face masks, and something that I was telling people was to consider the materials that they're using, because some of the thick ones can feel quite hot, quite uncomfortable to wear, whereas some of the more fabric ones can be a bit more gentle on your skin. So things like silk lined ones were a bit more pleasant. I've got a lavender spray that I put in mine, just to have a nice smell, which is quite calming. I like the lavender spray, but you can use any one that you like, and any other calming techniques. So maybe you like to listen to music or a podcast to kind of give you a bit of a distraction while you're there, or mindfulness techniques as well can be quite helpful. So various breathing activities. Have a look at some of the mindfulness apps that you can maybe practice while you're on the train as well.
Brilliant. That's great. Thank you. I think we'll just sort of finish off on this last question, although I am going 2 for 1 on this one.
Okay.
The first question is there any training for mental health first aiders? And the second part is, could we assign a mental health first aider to contact home workers for a general chat? Do you think this would be a good idea?
Good questions. Yes, there is training for mental health first aiders. There are various different courses that are available to you. I know that Posturite offer a varied amount of them. I teach mental health first aid myself. And to be a mental health first aider, all courses are 2 days, 2 9 to 5 days. Or sometimes they're broken up into 4 separate sessions. So yes, there is quite a comprehensive course that somebody has to complete to be a mental health first aider. And usually they're incredibly valuable because it goes through the signs and symptoms of different common mental health concerns. So we'll go through things like stress, anxiety, depression, self-harm. We'll talk about how to assist someone in suicide, experiencing suicidal crisis, psychosis, and it also covers things like mental health in the workplace and how to be a good listener. And a lot of people find it valuable, not just within work, but also in their personal life as well. Because as I said, 1 in 4 people experience poor mental health in any given year. It's very likely that you will have people in your close social circles that need support as well. So I do really recommend mental health first aid training. And the other question was, remind me.
Just whether you thought it was helpful to do for mental health first aiders to make calls to people at home.
Right.
Whether that would be useful.
Yes, I do think it would be useful, but I think about who it would be more meaningful coming from. Is it more meaningful signposting a mental health first aider to do it, or what about your team, your line managers or team managers? And I don't want to add too much to other people's plates, but if you want to drill good mental health culture into the workplace, having a team leader or a manager that genuinely wants to check in on you and see how you're doing might be more valuable than somebody saying, oh, can the mental health first aider call all the home workers and see how they're doing? And that might be quite overwhelming for managers, and I would really recommend managers go through some training as well. Doesn't necessarily have to be a 2-day course, but there are managers mental health first aid workshops that you can do, and that might help you feel more confident to ask those questions and know how to support somebody if they said, no, I'm not okay. So it's not a bad idea, but I would consider who would it be more meaningful from.
That's brilliant, Ellice. I think probably we're going to need to sort of wrap it up there. There are 1 or 2 questions that I may ask you maybe later just to sort of catch up with people on, but that's been a fabulous session, and certainly I've taken some tips from that. And I think probably I hand over to Matt now. Do you know, I think Matt might have some communication problems. Maybe I'll sort of step in here. So I think it's just to say